Hi, everyone, and welcome to Module 3, Design Thinking and Prototyping. Again, some of you might have had experiences with either. I'll just provide a basic overview of these concepts. If you want to hear more about it or you want to do more deep research, you're welcome to review the optional reading materials. It's certainly an interesting space. And playing around with prototypes is always a lot of fun. So, as you can imagine, there has been a lot of things said about design thinking back in my days. That's quite a while ago. But during my engineering days, design thinking, that was around, I want to say 2008, 9, 10, design thinking started to become a lot more popular. Right, so it used to be a bit more niche, started to kind of go through, started to get more traction in engineering, and then started to also get a lot more traction in business. So it's been a while since people kind of have discussed it, but it's a concept you should be familiar with. Somebody might throw it around in a meeting or might have a consultant over. So it's always good to kind of have a basic overview of the concept and what's it for. So in its most basic definition, I would call design thinking a creative problem-solving process. Okay, we talked about creativity, specifically organizational creativity and innovation capabilities. And so there has been a way, and it originates essentially from design. I mean, anything that you're familiar with architectural design or any areas related to that. The idea is really to take a very focused lens on a circumstance or a problem, and kind of use observation or systematic observation to derive some generalizable insights. Some of you might be familiar with the firm IDEO. They have kind of popularized that notion of design thinking. They're kind of there's a consulting company. They also have generated some books, I think. And so they go through companies and they look how some of their customer-facing processes, some look at kind of the design or the product development processes, to kind of help them figure these things out. But the real idea here about design thinking is be very customer focused, right? And not only look at, spending behaviors, demographics, and things like that, but really think and understand how customers interact with an object or a product or a service, right? Their emotions, their frustrations, their pain points. How do they actually use certain products and services versus how you thought they would actually use it, right? So this is kind of the idea. And at the center, it comes from this human-centered design paradigm that really focuses on looking at human behavior, look at the human emotions, and see what can be derived from those when designing and developing our product. Now, we talked about this, and you might have seen this if you've taken my Management 519 class. We talked about divergent and convergent processes in terms of brainstorming, right? So when we try to figure out how do we generate ideas and how do we converge to new ideas. And so design thinking in a way kind of follows a similar trajectory. And that means that we typically have 3 different stages, right? So the first stage is what they call inspiration or empathize, and it's really about understanding the problem, right? Not just, oh, this is kind of what we observe or what we think we observe, and then immediately draw up solution, but spending a lot of time to understand the complexities of the problem, right? Then once kind of that process is finished, you go over to ideation. and then ultimately to implementation. But particularly the early process is how to collect data, how to make these observations, and how to think about what kind of outcomes are we interested in order to develop something new. That's a pretty important phase. I took this picture from a book called Entrepreneurship, The Practice and Mindset. There is tons of materials on design thinking. As I said, I added some optional materials to the module, but you can find lots of books. And so if you're more interested in this topic, there's definitely plenty of material. This is a very good video. I'm not going to show it right here. I think you can access it yourself. I will post it on Facebook for you to review if you so want. There's also a bunch of TEDx design thinking videos that you can watch if you like. Again, it's not everybody will have the same exposure to design thinking, but it's good to kind of have a basic understanding of what are people talking about. Now, when we think about that, right? So when we think about kind of understanding the problem, we typically have to come up with a couple of, well, framing questions, right? And it's not so much, so we really want, in design thinking, it's really important that that exploratory phase early on is really driving the solution, right? Rather than, okay, we have a solution or we're thinking of a solution, let's test the solution if it's popular with the customers. That's also a perfectly legitimate method, and it's applied in different circumstances. But really, the idea of design thinking is perfect when you develop a new product or a new service. And there's a lot of potentially unknown factors that you need to incorporate. But also, you want to understand kind of the direction that seems to be the strongest pull or the strongest urgency for your customers, right? So you don't just want to impose that. You want to understand what really emotionally connects them in how they operate and how they do their everyday things, or how they potentially interact in situations that are relevant for your product design development process. It requires time. Not a lot of companies like to invest that much time to examine this issue, right? Because they have to assign resources, they have to assign so human resources, equipment, et cetera, potentially. And so they typically try to cut this relatively short. But here the idea is really to be as broad as possible, right? To start with very general kind of framing questions and then go your way from there. Here, for example, how might we, right? So design thinking is often used in circumstances where you're trying to find solutions for general problems, okay? And there is all kinds of design thinking classes and programs, but typically, if you ever have been in a accelerator, incubator environment, or you did a hackathon like to do that as well. They're trying to address broad problems and broad questions, and then kind of brainstorm around those to see if there are any solutions that people have not considered. And so again, these are some broad questions one can use. How might we enhance the entrepreneurship education experience of students, or the project management education, or the product development, or the business education? How might we improve how the elderly live independently? How might we reimagine how people get around in a town without cars? So this is an example. Okay, you can find other examples. What's really interesting, and coming from an engineering background, we didn't used to solve these things like that, right? So we had very narrow, very relatively well-defined problems, and we kind of find also well-defined solutions, right? But when the problem and the solution space become more complex, right, it's harder to really find a closed loop solution so quickly. You really have to open your eyes a little bit and kind of increase the scope of what you're looking at, right? You see this in a lot of other professions, right? They need to kind of take a broader perspective on what the problem could be, right? And what kind of constraints and boundaries they have. They might have not realized before, right? As you kind of solve. Entrepreneurship, right? Starting a new company is a pretty open problem, right? So yes, you have kind of an idea of what you want to do. Sometimes that idea is relatively clear. Let's say you want to start a restaurant or something like that. But let's say you want to develop a new app or a new function or a new diabetes drug. You have to be a little bit more flexible in some ways if you want to kind of overcome the constraints or the self-imposed constraints that some people have put on these. So let's take an example, okay, and you can look at different examples. You can look at everyday situations that you encounter. But let's say we see a woman in a grocery store trying to reach something on a high shelf, right? And we haven't really figured out a solution. This seems to be clearly an issue, and we've all encountered issues like that, where you're in a grocery store, or you're in another type of store, and something's really highly stacked up, and you have to figure out how to get there, right? Typically, you ask for somebody to help you, but here the idea is really, how do we kind of potentially start thinking about solutions, not as solutions, but first as a set of questions that help us generate some solutions, right? So, for example, we want to kind of figure out some boundary setting, right? So in this case, we could ask, what type of ladder does the woman need to reach products on a high shelf, right? How might we help customer reach products on a high shelf, right? We can use a different store, we can be more general. Or how can customers quickly notify store personnel to help with the items, right? And so that the third one is typically what we do, right? When we are not capable of reaching or seeing something, or we might ask a bystander to help. But that could be an opportunity for developing something that could be valuable to the store, valuable to the customers. The idea here is really to understand the position of that particular person, right? So, and by position here, I mean developing kind of a perspective of how do they interact, like what goes through them, does that annoy them emotionally? Is that a physical boundary? How do they approach the problem? And how can we help them solve that problem faster, or completely eliminate the problem to begin with? What we just did was theoretically, but we can do that on an everyday basis, right? We can observe people in an everyday location, and we can actually look for problems, frictions, inconsistencies, situations where there's clear annoyances that take people's time, effort, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's different ways, different dimensions of how we can think about this, right? First is the physical space. Now, not all problems have a physical location, so to speak, right? We can also think about this when we interact with websites, right? And then in this case, the website is a physical location in a way that's projected into a virtual world. We can think about who are the people involved. We can look at what they're doing, right? What are the acts that they're performing here? In this case is, she's trying to reach something on a high shelf. Her actions are, she's going to look around if she can't reach it, if there's something she can use to kind of step up, or where can she go and reach somebody to help her. The physical things that are present, right? So it's not only the actual, in this case, it's not only the actual object that that person wants to reach, but it could be the surrounding circumstances, right? Is it in a very crowded area? Are there other place, other objects around there that make it easier or potentially harder to do? Activity, we talked about as a set of related acts, but then acts, we can also break them down in single actions, right? And sometimes we want to do that, right? Kind of like a movie reel. We want to go like step by step. What are they doing to reach that goal or to solve that problem? Other ways for us to make this easier, more convenient, less onerous, etc., etc. A set of related activities that people carry out, event, right? Time, meaning the sequencing that takes place over time, the things people are trying to accomplish, and the emotions felt and repressed. Again, you can kind of extend that idea as much as you want. But here it's really about, right? Previously, we talked about empathy of the customer. We really want to try to understand as much as possible, right? And nowadays, now we talking about physical stores, websites like Amazon and Facebook are doing pretty much exactly that, but they're doing it on in an automated way, right? So they're using their algorithms, they're using they're using the data of how we interact with the platform. What do we like, what do we click, right? They create a space, essentially a virtual space for us to interact with that app. And in doing so, they're generating more data that helps them potentially. Using the word manipulation might be too negative, but they kind of use that they use that data to kind of put or move us into certain directions as customers. This is what's called an AEIOU. That's a framework, okay, that's used. There's all kinds of other frameworks that are used for that, that are used for the inspiration phase. But that's one of them. It's activities, environments, interactions, objects, and users, right? And there's a set of questions you can think about. You can, in the older days, when we needed cameras to do most of these things, this was a little harder. But if you think about, right, taking photographs today, making sketches is relatively easy, right? So you can actually document these circumstances pretty quickly and painlessly. Now, some of you have done customer interviews, I'm sure, in a variety of settings. Again, this is not giving you an exclusive look of how to conduct a customer interview. And again, it might sound pretty trivial to you, but really customer interviews are part of this design thinking process, a pretty key part, right? So you sometimes don't even consider them yet customers, you just consider them users or participants, right? And so you want to have a kind of framework, a starting point, and the best way to do is to kind of break it down in different components, right? So you want to think about how what do you need to prepare for the interview. Then you have to think about how you're going to conduct an interview, and then what happens after the interview, what kind of data you want to collect, do you want to follow up, etc., etc. This is the simplest case we can think of. Again, some of you might have done a lot more scripted, a lot more complex customer interviews. So just, stick with me here. The idea is you can use interviews for lots of things, right? And nowadays we do a lot more automated stuff, right? Because we try to get people to use digital technology so that way we can track them a lot easier, so we don't have to do this manually. But actually conducting a proper customer interview is still a valuable tool. This is an example. Okay, I took that from a entrepreneurship book They like to do that a lot too, right? So there's a few areas that really like customer interviews a lot, or prospective customers or prospective users. They're trying to figure out whether they can kind of gather some information that could be used later, or that's valuable for the purpose that they're um, planning. And again, there are some practices and rules you can consider if you want to discuss, if you're going to meet or discuss a customer interview. Again, this is probably no big thing for you. Most of you have the experience. But there is an art to it, right? And it requires preparation. It requires some experience, some circumstances to kind of put you in the right circumstances to get the information that you want. And people have used the analogy of peeling the onion here a lot, but the idea is really we want to use kind of a breadth and a depth of questions that give us kind of a scope that we want to collect, right? That we want to catch, but we also want to have a very strong specialization in a particular area. We want to think about what challenges they're facing, how do they talk about them, what are they doing about them, how do they feel about them, and what emotions driving their actions. That's really important, right? You can imagine in, again, the digital environment, Facebook, Snapchat, all these apps, Amazon, right? You want to sell people something, you want to keep people engaged on the platform. It's important to know what emotions are driving people's actions. It's incredibly helpful. And so understanding kind of the mechanisms behind that is critical. Again, this is pretty simple. Okay, state the purpose of the interview, take notes. If you record, obtain permission. Again, some of you have done that. A really key thing here is developing questions, and that's not always easy, right? I've done a fair amount of research interviews, and it's really hard to determine all the questions that you want to ask up front in the beginning, right? So once you've done a couple of exploratory interviews, you are capable to narrow down the questions a lot better, right? And this is just some general thing, okay? So there is some questions, interview questions, and some kind of ideas here. In all honesty, it's hard to really predict these things up front all the time, right? So you kind of you work your way into understanding people that you interview, right? Certainly, it helps to always have some backup questions. It always helps to look at things that people get really frustrated about, right? So again, when we look at what emotions control people behaviors, or what emotions are really expressed, we want to be really specific about that, right? Because understanding people's emotions, that can help us in our product development or design phase. Again, and how do we look for themes in your notes, right? And how do we reflect on these? There's tons of tools out there that you can use. You know, you can document them. I mean, you have now digital tools that help you do it. You can use different frameworks of how to sort those ideas, right? So, for example, you can sort them by competition, right? So what competitive products, for example, have those customers noted to use? What themes could be, you know, what is the relation? Are these products, or are the problem you're trying to solve connected to family, their work, or their private life, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to really give you a prediction of which themes you will encounter, right? But the idea that you have to kind of develop themes based on a lot of qualitative data is why a lot of firms as well as researchers use digital systems to help them sort through these things. And you can use AI, essentially AI systems to help you kind of find themes as well, right? So that's kind of the benefit of if you have a lot of this data, how do you sort it? Used to be manual, now we have kind of computer systems to work it out. Again, now we collect all this information, we do all those customer interviews, and the reality is we want to look at latent needs, right? And yes, we can look at the needs that are kind of obvious to customers, right? But we really want to look at needs that customers don't know they have yet, right? Because that's kind of valuable for a company to figure that out. But also, what kind of emotion or emotional frameworks are built around these? Again, if we want to think about this circumstance, right? If we want to develop kind of these ideas around needs that customers don't know they have, we need to be kind of open. We need to generate as many ideas as possible. And we need to improve on these ideas, right? So we need to have a kind of system in place of how to do that. And that, you can look at popular literature or existing literature, but you can also kind of develop your own system moving forward. Now, these are some general brainstorming rules. Again, if you scour the internet, you'll find, or ask ChatGPT, there's gonna be lots of different perspectives on brainstorming rules. But a couple of them is, again, avoid all judgment, let the creativity flow, right? So don't block ideas, try to generate as many ideas and different ideas as possible. Be open to not only support other people's ideas, but also help kind of develop them or expand them or modify them is as needed. You want to kind of stay on the topic. You want to, what they suggest, follow the one at a time rule, okay? Meaning that you want to give people space to express their ideas and discuss their ideas rather than going through too quickly or rather than interrupting them, and use visuals, right? So whether it's sticky notes, whether it's projectors, whether it's whether it's using a pen on a blackboard, right? There's different ways of how we can visualize, and again, generate as many ideas as possible. The general rule, okay, that they're suggesting is about 100 ideas in a 60-minute session, which is a lot, right? But it actually helps, and it gives you a lot of ideas that you can work with and kind of mold, modify, sort, etc., etc. This is what we call the empathy map. That's another technique that's been proposed. And so there's a couple of questions here. What did they say? What did they do? What might they be thinking? What emotions do you think they're experiencing, right? So we develop a set of questions here that help us understand and empathize with prospective users and customers. And this is one way to visualize it, right? But you see, you can whoever is your stakeholder, right? You can kind of think about what they think, what they feel, what they do, what they say. Stakeholder, you can use a problem statement. You can construct a problem statement like that. And you can have multiple problem statements for the same stakeholder, right? And as you kind of stack them, as you kind of move forward to continue with all this stuff, you can essentially, that helps you kind of structure these outcomes a lot better. Now, Some of you, I'm sure, have done prototyping in some form or shape. We used to build stuff in high school and the university in my engineering days. So we spent a lot of time in the shop. Typically, the shop environment or the machine shop environment is the place where most people have had some prototyping or building experience. Some people do prototyping at home. Okay, they build their own stuff or improve other people's stuff. The idea here is really we want to use prototyping not only to visualize, but also potentially test some ideas. And here I'm going to talk about two different types of prototyping. One is called low fidelity, the other one is high fidelity, and we'll go through these one by one. Again, some of you might have done this before, but the idea of low resolution prototyping is really that I can leverage any sort of material to try to prototype or visualize my idea, right? And here the thought is really, I want to make sure that I can give the potential users and customers something that they can actually play with, right? That they have something that they can kind of move, they can stretch, they can potentially kind of take multiple looks at. And I do this because it helps me keep iterate to a potential product prototype that the customer likes a lot more than others, right? And because these materials are relatively cheap and they're easy to manipulate, you can do multiple iterations without spending too much financial capital and in a relatively short time. Again, you can use it to convey your ideas. You can use it to look at the physical aspects, size, dimensions, color, aesthetics, ergonomics. You can show some of these things to your customers or investors, right? If they're, of course, sophisticated enough, that kind of helps them understand what you're trying to do. You might not be able to physically build something, right? So then you have other options like a lot of virtual 3D programs, but you can also just use paper and pen to sketch things out. Think about a process. So imagine you want to develop a new process. It helps if you can just sketch a process specifically out, right? What are the different steps? Who does what? When are they going to the firm? When are they kind of actions they have? And now, of course, we have a lot of virtual tools, right? We didn't have these virtual tools before. So you can actually store a lot of these sketches and these ideas, and you can also it's easier for you to communicate it through different teams. Imagine when we talked about virtual teams, right? It's really hard to share paper notes unless you kind of scan them and take a picture. Sometimes it's just easier to use a virtual kind of prototyping or sketching tool so that people can kind of manipulate these things at the same time. Here, the question, so we have another distinction here that is introduced, which is vertical versus horizontal prototypes. And the idea is really, do I want to focus on functionality or do I want to focus on a particular feature, right, of the product? And that's really a decision you have to make and have to figure out depending on kind of who your customer is, right? And what the customer wants and what potential other stakeholders want, right? So you're in a management meeting and they want you to kind of showcase maybe just a particular component, not the entire thing. But in software, for example, right, and you will have the opportunity when you discuss Eastern banks and their prototyping of that kind of product, this online small business loan processing product or a process in this case. They have to figure out, like the development team has to figure out, well, what do we want to focus on, right? So what prototype are we going to build and what functionalities or features will it have for us to work through. Again, we talked about low fidelity prototyping is iterative, right? So you can have a storyboard, you can have a wireframe, you know, a paper prototype, sketch, etc., etc. There is all variety of prototypes. Again, if you want to spend more time on that, I have some optional readings, but you can, you know, once you type in low fidelity prototyping or prototyping in general, you'll find plenty of materials and exercises to kind of work with. The idea is really most teams, right? So most product development teams, they have a set of tools that they're using that they like, that kind of helps them guide their creativity to kind of connect with customers or prospective users. Also keep in mind that your customers might have certain expectations of what that prototype should look like, right? Even if it's a low fidelity prototype. So you really have to determine which of these types would be most appropriate to showcase your idea. So we had low fidelity, high fidelity prototyping, and all of us, I mean, you should have heard about 3D printing at this point. In fact, there is also kind of a virtual 3D, well, they don't print it virtually in a way, but you have a lot of 3D software that can try to mimic or try to visualize the product as realistically as possible. And here the idea is, right, eventually, if you want to go ask somebody for money, or you want to go to a really big client that, you know, you want to convince to actually buy into your product, you want to build something that kind of looks more real, right? Even if it constrains the flexibility for iterative purposes. And so there's a bunch of tools, a bunch of prototyping tools now that are available, such as 3D printing, that help you kind of build these prototypes. Again, we look at this from different perspectives, right? So the level of fidelity will typically also come with more usability, right? Actual usability of the product, of how it is designed to come. It will constrain, right? There is a constrainment, right? So a prototype that is very usable will be only usable in certain directions, right? You can't modify it very much. So that keeps kind of the creativity and flexibility in a certain direction, versus in the early phase of your prototype development, you definitely want to have iterations, right? You want to have options. And so this is kind of just showing you, essentially giving you this idea and direction. I leave you here with the Stanford Design School. By the way, Stanford Design School is a pretty well-known, well, Stanford in general, of course, is a well-known university, but the Stanford Design School is one of the leading, if not the leading, institution on design thinking and product design in general. And they have all kinds of materials. You just type in Stanford Design School, and they have a whole set of things that they offer. You can do, I think, paid classes and paid workshops. A lot of companies in that area send their employees to go to the Stanford D School to do a course. Again, they focus on a similar framework that we discussed, right? Empathy, definition, ideation, prototyping, and testing. And so kind of making sure that in a design thinking process, we're going to capture all these 5 areas. All right, so that concludes module 3. I hope you enjoyed that and it was informational. Please reach out if you have any questions, and I'll see you soon in module